joined academia in 2012, initially at the University of Queensland in Australia. I moved to Princeton in 2018, where I'm tenured. My main research focus is on trying to translate the science and modelling that academics apply to kind of configure the energy transition to the real world, focusing on 4 challenges. The sort of infrastructure delivery challenge, the financing challenge, the social licence challenge, and the workforce development, workforce expansion challenge. So that involves getting much more granular than the typical academic study would do. So I co-led a study called Net Zero America, which was a very granular projection of 5 pathways for the US to go to net zero in 2050. It was quite instrumental in guiding the policy formation here, but also attracted a lot of attention from media, from government, and from the private sector. I was also an investigator on the Net Zero Australia project, which was led by University of Melbourne, University of Queensland, and Princeton. So that was an interesting study different study because it actually decarbonised the export. So it decarbonised the Australian economy by 2050, but it also sought to substitute fossil fuel exports with clean carriers by 2060. And I also am currently co-leading similar projects in India, China, and Brazil. In terms of nuclear, so the other thing I should say is I'm an advisor to a number of companies, large industrial or energy companies who are trying to grapple with this transition that they are facing. Now, I'm not a nuclear power expert, a nuclear technology expert, but I do have a good understanding of the cost, performance, and time challenges, and I generally follow what's happening. I sit on the Sustainability Advisory Council for the Dow Chemical Company, who has committed to a small modular reactor project in Texas. And among the corporate partners that are sponsoring work I do is Google, who has also obviously entered into significant partnerships with small modular reactors. I would echo the things Professor Winfield said about cost and time. Highly uncertain, and it's very heterogeneous across the planet. So if you look at the US, it's true. The project in the Midwest, which was cancelled, the cost at completion estimate was started at $8,000, and I'm thinking US dollars here, a kilowatt, ended at 20,000. The forecast was 20,000 when it was cancelled. And you mentioned the Vogtle project, and that is sort of in the same kind of realm of cost. However, if we look at the United Arab Emirates, for example, they seem to be building for about $5,700 a gigawatt, but that's a large-scale project. And their time frame was roughly 12 years from final investment decision to commercial operating date. And so probably a 5-year period of feasibility studies and site selection in front of that. If you go to China, then the capital cost estimates are about half that. So you've got this enormous range of sort of anything from just below $3,000 a kilowatt in China to sort of $5,000 to $6,000 in the Middle East, to sort of getting up towards 15 to 20 to 25 even in the United States. If we look at the small modular reactors, the people who are ordering them right now, Dow being one of them, and Google and Microsoft and OpenAI and Meta, they don't know what the cost is going to be yet, right? So these are all projects which are in the sort of scoping and pre-feasibility, and the suppliers, whether it's Kairos or Helion or X-Energy, are still kind of forming their views about cost. They have targets, but frankly, none of us have any confidence in those targets. So we just don't know what they will cost. So that said, I'm on the record, and I think you're probably aware, of saying that I think the regulatory obstacles to deploying nuclear in Australia should be lifted. It is a clean, firm generation technology that I see no, and safe, that I see no credible reason that it should not be allowed to compete. That said, I have no idea whether it would compete, whether you would find financiers to invest, how much they would cost, and how long they would take. Though you would have to say if the UAE took 12 years from FID, 16 years from initial conception, we would have to be looking at something longer than that typically in Australia. Happy to close there.
Thank you, Dr. Gregg. Thank you. We'll go into questions now. My question's for Professor Winfield. By how much does Ontario subsidise its citizens' electricity, and how much does this contribute to the provincial deficit?
The current figure is $7.3 billion per year, and that is coming directly out of general revenues. So that is money that otherwise would be going to schools or hospitals or whatever other expenditures you would expect. And as of the economic statement tabled by our Minister of Finance last week, that would account for the entire provincial deficit and then a little bit. So it is a very significant expenditure that's occurring to lower. It sort of takes the form of a rebate on residential consumers' bills, but there's other things going on behind the scenes as well that are designed to keep electricity, or what we call hydro costs, down from a consumer perspective.
Cheers, thank you. Last week we heard, the week before, we heard from a witness in a previous hearing, Dr. Addy Patterson, that Australia could build 7 nuclear power reactors in 11 years, and this would drive down power prices. He cited Finland. Do you agree with this opinion? And that's for both of you guys.
I would say, one would need to look at the specifics of what is being proposed, but given the numbers we're seeing, and I would mention particularly the Book 2 project in Finland and the Vogtle plant in the United States, I don't think that would be very realistic. The timelines for construction in Finland, the whole thing is approaching 20 years. Vogtle ran 11 years, I think, behind schedule. Darlington, in our case, initiated in the mid-70s, completed in the mid-90s, which is the last actual plant built in Canada. And then the cost, one would have to look again, as like we're both hinting, that this problem that we don't have really good data points. But again, if you look at the costs associated with the 4 actual projects, of which Vogtle is and the Book 2 in Finland are the completed ones, the numbers do not inspire confidence, to put it mildly. To build 4 Vogtle-type reactors at that cost in Ontario, allowing for exchange rates, which is sort of what's proposed at Bruce Seal, they haven't specified the technology, would put you in the $100 billion range. I don't know how we'd ever pay for that, to be honest.
Thank you. And
that's sort of referencing the the actuals on the Vogtle project, which is the most recent completed project now in service in North America.
Thank you. And Dr. Chris, do you agree? Dr. Gregg, do you agree with that?
Can you just repeat the numbers that Ali was suggesting?
He said that you could build 7 nuclear power reactors in 11 years, and this would drive down power prices.
So are these 7 nuclear reactors SMRs or large-scale reactors?
Didn't exactly say so.
Okay.
But what the
So-
opposition is proposing is 2 SMRs and 5 nuclear reactors.
I'm sorry, that's incorrect. That's incorrect. That is not our proposal. I'll speak for our proposal. But if you want to ask your question, Chair, then I'm more than happy when the Chair gives me the microphone to ask my questions. I'm happy to explain.
No worries. So what is your proposal then?
Uh,
I'm sorry, who's giving evidence here, Chair? Do I have the microphone now to ask my questions?
No, you don't.
I'll
Okay.
just ask the question. I'm happy to. So 11 projects, if they were large-scale projects, which I doubt they would be, if you look at even the Middle East, which would be a pretty optimistic for Australia to match, right? Yeah, our experience with LNG and large-scale infrastructure, certainly in the north of Australia, is that we are one of the high-cost regions of the world. The UAE projects, they built 5 gigawatts roughly over a period of 12 years. And that's not including the feasibility, permitting and upfront costs. So they were about 17 years to deliver 5 gigawatts. If you look at the small modular reactors, and the only projects I'm familiar with are in the US, the most ambitious targets that have been set, Dow has announced the target to have 1 operational by the early 30s. And that project has already got permitting, right? So, well, not got permitting, but it's been long in the progress of getting permitting. And that is considered a pretty optimistic estimate. If you look at Google's announcement with Kairos, it's to have 5 gigawatts operational by 2039 and 320 megawatts operational by the early 30s. The Dow project's 320 as well. So essentially, the most optimistic estimates we've got for SMRs that have them running in the early 30s, and these are projects that people have been working on with feasibility studies and have sites already for the last couple of years. So 11 projects within 11, 7 projects within 11.
7 projects with 11 years.
Extraordinarily ambitious.
No worries. Thank you, Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. What I might do is clarify what I said before then having the opportunity to ask questions. So the Chair incorrectly suggested that it is coalition policy to build 7 reactors, 7 power plants in 11 years, as is indeed on the record multiple times. It is coalition policy that we adopt a civil nuclear power program. We have identified 7 locations around the country. We have said that based on best practice internationally, you should be looking at having multiple units at each site, and the earliest possible electricity coming to the grid from the first unit of the first site, if it were an SMR, would be 10 years. If then it were to be a large reactor, it would be 2 or more years from there. The first electricity from the first unit to hit the grid, which is vastly different from what the Chair just suggested, of saying that it is our plan for there to actually be 7 power plants built entirely within 11 years. That is not our plan.
I didn't say that at all.
And
I said
I will
that's
not,
what Dr. Adi Patterson said.
As for Dr.
Chair.
Adi Patterson, I think it's probably worthwhile that maybe through the Secretariat we get clarity on that. I don't want us to be verbalising, nor for me to be misinterpreting what he said. My interpretation of what he said was that in the event of Australia having a 7 power plant fleet to unroll, could those be delivered in 11 years? Not all at one time concurrently, but is there any reason why each of them would not be done in 11 years? To which he said that is possible. So if I can now, Chair, just go to my questions now that we've clarified that. Firstly, thank you very much, Professor Winfield and Dr. Gregg. I hope the time zone is not killing you. It's good for us, so thank you very much. Just on timelines, maybe, since that's where the conversation went. Professor Winfield, on your comments there about how long it takes, I understand that in Ontario, you managed to build around 20 zero-emissions nuclear reactors within a 22-year period, creating one of the world's cleanest energy grids, one of the cleanest electricity grids in the world, at a pace which was only beaten by Norway, Sweden and France in terms of decarbonisations. So that's pretty impressive. But have I got that wrong?
Timeline roughly from late 1960s to, it's closer to 30 years by the time we count everything, to the mid-90s was the build-out period. But I would emphasize the cost there and consequences.
No, I'm sorry, and given
effectively bankrupted itself doing that.
So, and I'll get to some other questions, but just on timing, are you saying that's incorrect? That Ontario actually didn't build around 20 reactors within a 22-year period? Is that incorrect, sir?
I would have to check the start dates on Pickering A. I mean, if you go back to Douglas Point, which was the first one, which is early 60s, it gives you more of a 30-year time frame.
If you could take it on notice, then no problem if you're not aware today. If I can just go to the comments then on subsidies for households that you mentioned, and can I assure you, by the way, that there's lots of subsidies in Australia too. You're not on your own. I'm from the state, or the province, if you like, of Queensland. The federal government here, just over the last year, has announced $3.5 billion in subsidies. In my state alone, we've probably got another $2 billion plus on top of that. I know that my own household, my wife and kids, well, probably about $1,300 is coming our way to subsidise electricity, so you're not on your own. But according to the Regulated Price Plan report by the Ontario Energy Board, around half the subsidies, which is, I believe, $6 to $7 billion or so a year to which you refer, subsidises electricity bills to offset the cost of power purchasing agreements for wind and solar projects, which resulted from Ontario's Green Energy Act. Would the Ontario Energy Board have that right, do you think?
Yes, but it's very complicated in terms of what's actually gone on there. There has been a lot of maneuvering around in the rate base. For reasons I don't fully understand, the government took the renewables off that component, which they off the rate base, and seems to be paying it directly for reasons that I don't understand. But part of what's going on here, though, is that there is effectively an adder to the basic electricity rate, something called a global adjustment, which captures the capital costs of activities in the electricity sector. Now, that includes nuclear and it does include renewables. Nuclear on the generation side has consistently been the largest component of the global adjustment, and that component has been driven by the refurbishments, the first wave of refurbishments and now the second wave of refurbishments of the existing nuclear plants. So there's an element of both renewables and nuclear in the global adjustment, which is sort of what pushes the price up, because the hourly market clearing price is pretty much meaningless in terms of capital investment in the
Thank
system.
you. If I could just get another question on that basis. So I think you've confirmed that the Ontario Energy board is most likely accurate in that regard. And you did say, though, I heard you loud and clear, that the global adjustment does include for nuclear as well as renewables. Before you said the refurbishment cost would be about $50 billion. I note the PPAs to which I refer cost around $62 billion over a 20-year period. You were recently featured in an article here in Australia in the Sydney Morning Herald, published on the 28th of October, entitled "You Couldn't Make This Up. Expert Pans Ontario Nuclear Option." Are you familiar with that article?
Yep.
So that article claims that cost overruns on nuclear projects in Ontario, and then it quotes you as saying there's a legacy of that still in the system, that we're effectively subsidising electricity bill to the tune, I'm not sure if you said 6 or 7 a year out of general revenues, etc. So, as we've already established, around half of the government subsidies relate to wind and solar. But the article was silent on that fact. Instead, the article reads as though all of that subsidy is due to nuclear energy, which now we know from your evidence is not the case. So my question, Professor, is were you incorrectly represented by the journalists in that article, or did you yourself incorrectly represent the data?
Neither. We're clear. I mean, the statement was in the overall picture. We're subsidizing to the tune of $7.3 billion. The big driver of the costs around electricity is the global adjustment in the rate base. That has been about 50%, and that is driven by nuclear costs. Now, there was some restructuring of this around 2022 to, for some reason, move the renewables element separately. There's a long story behind the renewables component, too, and we can talk about what went on there, because we did undoubtedly pay too much, but that was a question of program design as opposed to inherent costs in renewables. The bottom line is that the nuclear refurbishments, and keeping in mind we're talking about refurbishments as opposed to going forward, have been the biggest driver in terms of the overall increases in electricity rates in Ontario since the early 2000s. They're the biggest single component of the global adjustment, which is where those capital costs go.
Professor, do you know what the power prices are here in Australia?
I have seen various articles describing it at various levels.
Right. So you were quoted.
Exactly what we're talking about.
So this entire article to which I refer is challenging the leader of the opposition here in Australia's comparison of power prices paid in Australia compared to those in Ontario. And by the evidence, Ontario, it's at least half the cost of what it is here in Australia. I've even, beyond speaking to the government, visiting Ontario, I've also just gone to the trouble of getting individual power bills. I've compared power bills in Australia. Most recently, looked at South Australia, a small business paying around 50 cents a kilowatt hour, a household 44 cents, which is all good, by the way, because South Australia, the default market offer could be 56 cents a kilowatt hour. And then a friend of mine in Ontario got him to send me his power bill. It comes in around 18 cents. 18 cents, right? So, I know that's just one simple example, but it also reconciles with the data I've received, including directly from the government in Ontario when I visited, which basically showed that the impact on electricity prices and the fact that nuclear, second only to hydro, actually brings prices down for consumers. So if you aren't fully aware of the Australian power prices, and the research certainly I've done suggests that Ontario, it's probably at least half the price that Australians pay, I'm wondering why in this article, which talks about, you couldn't make this up, there being a comparison, according to you, comparison between Australia and Ontario. I'm just trying to reconcile that view, Professor.
Before you answer that, Professor Winfield, could you please table those documents, Deputy Chair?
I'm more than happy to, but I'll be taking out individuals' names and numbers and so forth, but more than happy to.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Professor.
Yep. So I've been in discussions with colleagues in Australia about this. It seems the rate bases are quite different in terms of what goes in. Particularly how things like transmission and distribution costs are dealt with between the two jurisdictions. One needs to keep in mind in Ontario, though, that we did strand a large amount of the debt associated with nuclear. So effectively, what you end up with is paying the operating plant costs on the plants, not the capital costs, and that's a very important distinction. We also have a large legacy hydroelectric component, which again, capital costs were retired a century ago. But what's particularly relevant here is we're not talking about the past, we're talking about the future. And what we're talking about is what new build nuclear would cost in Australia or Ontario. And in that case, the numbers we get looking at the experiences in Finland and the United States and on the incomplete projects in France and the UK as well, puts the basic electricity cost into certainly the 30, possibly 40 to 50 cent per kilowatt hour range just for the electricity. That's not counting transmission and distribution. And it's not clear if those figures are taking into account all of the issues around waste management, accident liability relief, decommissioning costs, and a range of other subsidies which are built in for the nuclear side in ways that don't appear on electricity bills.
Thank you, Professor Winfield. Thank you, Deputy Chair. Dr. Ryan, do you have any questions?
Well, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Professor Winfield. So your Ontario has a long experience in production and delivery of electricity via nuclear sources. If you could take your province back to the early 1960s and you were making decisions about how to deliver power going forward, would you choose nuclear?
It's a good question in terms of what paths we took. In the early 60s, it probably looked like a good option in the sense that we had uranium mines in Northern Ontario. We don't anymore. It's a long part of the story too. Certainly by the mid-70s, it was becoming apparent that there were serious problems. And there were certainly very serious debates about whether the Darlington facility should have been built or not. The alternatives as of the 60s would have been, we did build some coal, and that did come back and haunt us in a very serious way when the oldest part of the nuclear fleet failed and had to be taken out of service virtually overnight. We had to take 7 reactors out of service. We could have looked at hydroelectric further. We could have had conversations with our neighbors in Manitoba and Quebec, who have large hydroelectric resources, which we could have accessed. We could have, although at that time we didn't really think in terms of energy productivity, but those are directions we might have taken as well. Certainly, I would say by the 1970s, by the time we were at the point where we're considering Darlington, there was a very, very serious debate about whether to continue down that pathway and whether that plant should be built at all.
Okay, so I guess my question is that with 60 years of experience of nuclear power, at the end of the experiment, or if you want to call it that, in Canada, you're unconvinced that it was the right decision for Canada to make at that time? Or do you have an opinion regarding that?
I think we're still dealing with the legacy. I mean, we bankrupted one provincial utility. We had another pushed to the edge. We have 3 million waste fuel bundles in storage at nuclear power plants that will require management on time scale of 1 million years. for which we have no management structure. They're sitting in swimming pools at Darlington and Darlington and Pickering at the moment, as they have been since the day they came out of the reactor. So I think it's kind of a speculative history kind of question about, well, what choices different might we have made before I was born in terms of what path we might have taken. I think certainly by the time I joined this conversation, which was somewhere in the 1990s, there were very, very serious questions about the path we'd taken. And when the question came up, should we refurbish and rebuild the existing reactor fleet versus taking other pathways, I was very definitely among those who were saying we really should be thinking about what alternatives there might be in terms of a way forward for Ontario at that stage. And indeed, we did quite detailed modelling around what those pathways might look like.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Ryan. Mr. Bennell.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to go to Dr. Gregg, if I could, please. Can I just clarify? So there's a figure of between 1.3 and 1.5 trillion dollars being cited in the Australian climate and energy debate. For example, the Australian newspaper has said Australia must find 1.5 trillion dollars by the end of the decade to meet 2050 green targets in an effort experts say would need to mirror the reconstruction of Europe after World War II. Can I clarify precisely what the number is modelling?
That's modelling the capital cost that needed to be committed to be on a path to decarbonise both the domestic economy and the export economy.
Right.
So essentially, if you think about capital commitments, you commit capital that is going to be spent 5 years ahead on a project. So the number they're quoting is the actual level of capital commitment. Of that commitment, let's say 80 to 90% would be actually spent and assets in the ground. And the majority of it would be on the domestic system in 2030.
Right.
Because the exports don't really kick off until after that.
I also just wanted to you did briefly mention this in your opening statement, but I just wanted to go back to it. And I wanted to get confirmation that Net Zero Australia's July 2023 media release says nuclear power should not be in our plants because it's too expensive and slow. Only a dramatic fall in costs and prolonged renewable constraints would prompt a rethink. And I just wanted to frame that on the basis also around the fact that you worked on the Net Zero America project paper using similar tools and found that nuclear made sense over there. So
in one scenario, so actually in the case of Net Zero Australia, we did not allow nuclear to participate in the 5 or 4 core scenarios. And the reason was we were basing it on technologies which were available today. So in the absence of a regulatory reform that would allow nuclear in the system, it was excluded from those scenarios. That's not the case in the US. In the US, 4 of the 5 scenarios, well, one scenario had 0 nuclear. 3 of the 4 remaining scenarios had small amounts of nuclear and allowed the existing fleet to be life extended. And then one scenario, which we constrained renewable build rates to roughly 50% of the historical maximum, 35 gigawatts a year, then nuclear and CCS played big roles in that. It's kind of an artefact of modelling. If you don't allow a certain technology to grow at more than a certain rate, then you're forever going to the next available lowest cost option. So the other part of the statement for Net Zero Australia, so there's a reason why the core scenarios had no nuclear. What we then did is say, okay, let's allow nuclear to participate from 2035. And using what the current estimate levels are, nuclear didn't end up in the energy mix in a lowest overall system cost optimisation. if we halve the cost of nuclear, let's say to the levels that you might expect in the Middle East or or even China, then it did deploy, but to a limited extent. Now you've got to, even in the renewable constrained case in Net Zero Australia, these are still very courageous rates of expansion for renewables, which we haven't hit, haven't even gone close, right? So I think you've got to take the modelling for what it is. It's a least overall system cost optimisation model. It depends on the assumptions you put in. I think so long as, I don't necessarily stand behind the statement that we shouldn't build anything. Right? I think we should allow everything, but to compete. And if it's cost effective and there's a business case and you can mobilise the capital and the supply chains and the capacity, okay, let it go.
Thank you for that. I just got one last question to Professor Winfield. I just want to go back to that comment you made earlier about 3 million waste bundles sitting in cooling pools. So how much waste has been generated per year from the reactors in Canada?
It's about 85 to 90,000 fuel bundles per year.
Wow.
That would be spread over the operating reactor fleet.
Do you know how many Coke cans that would be the equivalent of?
Well, each fuel bundle is about the size of a fireplace log, so you'd have to figure that out in Coke can equivalents, which I would assume probably around 2 dozen. So I think it'd be 3 million times 2 dozen would be the equivalent volume of Coke cans. The issue, though, is not so much volume. The issue is that there are multiple issues with the waste fuel. One is it's physically hot when it comes out of the reactor, but it's all highly radioactive when it comes out of the reactor. The swimming pools are supposed to be for the first 50 years or so while it cools down a bit. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization's planning assumption then is that long-term management or disposal would need to occur on a time frame of 1 million years. So it would need to be isolated from the environment and human contact for 1 million years. There are other dimensions to that beyond the sort of direct physical risks. There are isotopes in the waste fuel that would potentially be of interest to someone interested in making nuclear weapons. And there are also risks. The fuel bundles themselves are a security risk in the sense of fire and things like that. So it's quite a complicated problem in terms of what to do with the waste fuel. And one of the problems, we didn't even start thinking about this until the 1970s when we were already sort of deeply down this pathway.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bennell. Mr. Chester?
Mr. Kennedy will get that's okay, Chair.
Yep, no worries. Mr. Kennedy?
Yeah, okay. Hi, Dr. Gregg, just a couple of questions for you. In that net zero plan, do you think Australia is on track to meet the projected rollout rates of renewables that were projected in that document?
No.
Not
close.
Not even close. Can you say a little more about that?
Look, I don't keep track of deployment rates closely in Australia, but as I understand it, we're probably pushing up against 5 gigawatts a year, allowing for solar, wind and rooftop solar. We would need to be hitting maybe 5 times that. I'd have to look it up, but we're well short of that rate.
Thank you, Doctor.
And it looks like it's pretty sticky, right? It looks like it's hard to get much faster.
And are you familiar with the projected rollout rates in our ISP as well, the AEMO ISP?
No, I'm not. I haven't looked lately. But keep in mind, the ISPs are very different. It's focused entirely on the domestic economy. It's focused on domestic electricity only. Net Zero Australia was a whole of economy decarbonisation pathway, including export industries.
Yes. Well,
they're not.
Yeah, the ISP is, in 2030, it's projecting onshore wind rollout rates will all be almost 500% more than they have ever been in Australia's history in that year, which I think they peaked around 2019-20. In your experience, do you think that's credible, you know, to be able to increase in the next 4 years by 500% what we've done ever?
Not doing things the way we have traditionally done them. So this is something I do a lot of work on, not just on renewables, but on all sorts of technologies. You know, globally, OECD has become slower at being able to do nation-building infrastructure development. And so, you know, we have to rethink how we do that. I think governments have to lean in more. There's got to be a lot more cooperation amongst the private sector. We have to rethink community benefits. Permitting reforms are so urgent. So, you know, doing things the way we've done, we will miss these targets. And the same is true in the US and Europe, in my view.
Yeah. So it's...
yeah.
And is that one of the reasons why you asked for a lift on nuclear? Because I know there was looking at deploying different technologies in some of the scenarios, enabling different technologies. But is it your view we should have all technologies competing given the challenge of actually getting to net zero?
Yeah, that's exactly what I wrote in, I did an AFR op-ed maybe a few months ago, before the announcement of the position policy. I just think we're underestimating what tackling the climate challenge is. It's going to take all hands on deck. It's going to take all technologies, and it's going to take a lot stronger lean-in by both government and the private sector.
And just on the Net Zero America report you worked on the 5 different scenarios, what was the lowest cost solution scenario there?
You know, they were all pretty similar. The lowest cost one was, so it depends what you mean by cost, right? So the total system cost, including the levelised net present value of all operating and all capital investments over the period, was about the same for both the mid-range optimal project. So this was one with no constraints. So it had 3,000 gigawatts of renewables, it had 1 billion tonnes of CCS, and it had 12 gigawatts of nuclear. Very similar to that one was the renewable constrained scenario, which had half the amount of renewables, almost double the CCS, and about 300 gigawatts of nuclear. The other metric that's always of interest, because one of the things I'm interested in is capital flows, is the total capital invested. So there's a difference between the overall system cost impacts and the actual capital you have to allocate. And the lowest capital allocation one is the renewable constrained one. So essentially renewable heavy scenarios are capital intensive. They're low on operating costs, but they're capital intensive.
Yeah, and renewables constrained, did that have, so you said the lowest capital cost, just to make sure I understood that.
Yeah. Sorry, renewables constrained, that's right.
Was the lowest capital cost.
Yeah.
And we're worried about capital cost extensively in Australia. So the lowest capital cost was renewables constrained. Just to clarify your answer there, that had nuclear in it. That was a large, renewables constrained meant big uptick of nuclear. It's not a question, I just want to clarify what you're saying.
Correct.
Okay. And
that's it, Mr. Kenny. We've got to get to some other questions as well. Okay, thank you. Mr. Perrott?
Thank you. Question to Professor Winfield. I just want to understand the Canadian comparison. And first question is, does Canadian nuclear energy go across the river into Detroit, that big industrial area?
Basically, no. The only time we export to the United States significantly is when we're in a condition known as surplus baseload generation, which means that the minimum output from the system, which is defined by the operating nuclear plants, exceeds domestic demand. And indeed, in those situations, we've actually ended up paying a negative price.
Okay.
So we pay Michigan to take the power off our hands. So there's some cross-border, but it's not significant. The biggest significant cross-border relationship with the US states has been those situations where we've had to offload the SPG.
Okay. So that you've got, Canada has basically 7 sites, is that right? The 7 sites with 19 currently operating?
No, 4 sites.
Down to 4 now, basically.
We're down to 4. There's 1 in New Brunswick, 3 in Ontario.
Okay. So those, the data suggests there's been 25 nuclear reactors over the last 35 years, all in basically southern Ontario, within about 120 kilometres of each other. So it's a very concentrated nuclear site apart from the New Brunswick one.
Well, there were 22 actual power reactors, 20 in Ontario, 1 in New Brunswick, and 1 in Quebec. In Ontario, the Darlington and Darlington and Pickering, which between them are 12 reactors on the north shore of Lake Ontario to the east of Toronto. Yeah, they'd be within 50 kilometres of each other. The third facility is at Bruce, and that's a couple of 100 kilometres north up the Bruce Peninsula, a place called Tiverton, which is on the shores of Lake Huron.
Okay, so all close to water, plentiful supply of water. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an absolutely crucial element because of the need for cooling water to operate the system. So yes, it's no accident that these reactors are either on the Atlantic Ocean, the St. Lawrence River, or the Great Lakes.
And then I just wanted to go to the approach to waste. Is all of the waste still in Ontario?
Yes, all of the waste except for at Gentilly and La Pro in New Brunswick and Quebec. No, all the waste is still in Ontario. It's actually still at the reactor sites.
So does New Brunswick come to Ontario, or it stays on site?
No, it's staying on site at La Pro at the moment. The federal government is pursuing a centralized nuclear waste storage, disposal, management facility, which in theory would take all of the waste reactor fuel. But that does not exist yet. They've still been trying to identify sites. So at the moment, the waste fuel just stays on the reactor sites. At Pickering and Darlington, it's in the cooling pools. At Bruce, they've begun to move some of it into dry storage on land, but those containers only last about 50 years.
And so you've had 75 years to work out where the waste will be, but you still don't have a location. And I was wondering if anyone, and this is for Professor Gregg as well, has anyone done a calculation of the cost of storage over the next million years? Like, it must be a fun process.
The capital costs that the Nuclear Waste Management Organization works with in Canada is $26 billion. Principally for moving all the stuff to a location and then constructing the storage facility, which is assumed to be somewhere deep underground. So that's and then the ongoing maintenance costs. So the figure NWMO has given is $26 billion.
Thank you, Professor sorry.
The only comment I'd make about the waste is if you look at the impact on the levelised cost of energy over the life of a project of a large fleet, it's actually fairly modest in the scheme of things. The bigger problem is actually permitting and getting a waste facility built, right? We've tried to do this in the US. We've been unsuccessful, mainly due to a lot of social and political opposition. Sweden has done a much better job at it, and that's probably a case that you should have a look at.
news overnight said the municipality of South Bruce actually voted in favour of declaring itself a willing host for a deep geological repository for Canada's intermediate and high-level waste. So you might have a bit of luck coming your way, Professor, after all.
Well, the vote in South Bruce was very close, so only a margin of 75 votes. And crucially, the consent of the Saugeen Ojibwe First Nation is not in place yet. There has also been a vote in a place called Ignace in Northern Ontario, again, a very small, very, very small community. But again, the consent of the First Nations in whose territory this would be located is far from forthcoming at this stage of the game.
We've got it all ahead of us too, with the AUKUS deal we've got with our nuclear-propelled submarines. The government's looking for a permanent repository, so we'll be learning from you, I'm sure, regardless of what happens with our plans for a civil program. Thanks, Chair. That's all from me.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. That was a really good input there. Thank you, Professor Winfield and Dr Gregg, for your time today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, including questions on notice, please forward it to the Secretariat by Thursday, the 28th of November 2024. Please note that responses to questions on notice will be published on the website as submissions to the inquiry. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to assist you with answering questions taken on notice today, and you'll have an opportunity to request corrections to the transcription errors. Thank you. I would like to thank all committee members and witnesses for their time today, the Hansard and the Secretariats for their time as well, and I declare this public hearing closed.
Thank you. Good night. Thanks very much.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
If we could just do a quick private meeting.